How long does painting take? Now, I've often wondered about the exact answer, but have only really given it a passing thought. I have met some people who talk about how long it takes to finish a project, and using the phrase like 100 hours or 200 hours or maybe even 300 hours to describe their dedication, and don't get me started on 400 hours. But I wanted to take the opposite approach. I want to condense the process to as short of a time as possible, minus the build. I'm only including build footage so I can make an intro. So far, I've usually been able to fully hand paint and weather a kit in 4 days, give or take. Let's see what I can do in half that time. Let's see what I can do in 48 hours. For this video, I'll be working on the high-grade Efreet custom. It's the Gundam base version, and I normally wouldn't repaint a kit with the finish, but I don't like the metallic injection in orange, and I can find this kit pretty easily. I knew that I could potentially cheat things with this video by picking something small like a Haro or an SD kit, you get the idea, but the Efreet is a similar size to what I mainly build. I knew that I could also cheat things by just doing some panel lining, adding decals, some minor weathering and a top coat, but to be as honest and realistic as possible, I'm tackling this kit the way I usually do, just with a time limit. And for a bit of heads up, I did the priming and the metallic undercoat before I set this timer. The camera started rolling at night, and I'm not going to be spraying Mr. Surfacer or Tamiya metallics inside. I've made my peace with all the macroplastics in my bloodstream from building lots of plastic models, but rattle cans are kinda where I draw the line. That is, until we venture into resin. Painting the main color really fought me. I mixed up this light blue and I just couldn't get the coverage I wanted. I normally like patchiness and imperfections. I'm not really a fan of even perfect coats. It falls into line with my philosophy towards painting and weathering, but I introduced patchiness as a choice. This was just how the paint acted, and I have a few theories on why. The first is the undercoat. I usually use Tamiya light gunmetal, but this time I used metallic black over the black Mr. Surfacer, which ended up darker but also glossier. And the second is about the light blue. This color is a 50-50 mixture of off-white and Andrea blue. A paint which has a slight semi-gloss finish, is very thin and slightly transparent. I actually think my bottle of the blue was on the defective side. Because of this, the paint I mixed up was slightly glossy and felt kind of sticky. So I was painting a thinned out glossy paint over a glossy black surface. It was also very humid when I was painting, and the brush I was using was a round instead of a flat one, and all of this resulted in a pretty frustrating experience. It didn't help that I couldn't figure out my secondary colors beforehand. I usually have some sort of color palette to go off of, but I didn't really know what I wanted other than some sort of blue. I actually thought of just using pure Andrea blue, but ended up with this mixture somehow. And while I was painting, I really wasn't even a fan of this blue either. I only stick with it because I couldn't come up with another color to use, and also out of defiance. And this was weird because I can usually come up with color palettes pretty easily, and this kind of set the tone, at least for the painting. When you paint light colors, your mistakes are a lot more noticeable, and if you looked at this thing with any sort of detail, you can tell that it's hand painted. I think that you can tell all of my work is hand painted, but with this build, it's really obvious. If you're new to hand painting, you might think that you should start painting older kits. So if you mess up, you aren't ruining anything. I know that's the way I thought about things, but I'd actually recommend a newer kit. Not only does this Efreet have great detail, it has great articulation, which allows you to pose the kit while painting and get color where you want it. I rarely take things apart while painting, and having a newer kit is really helpful because I can just manipulate the kit where I want. I do manage though to introduce some other colors. I decided on white pretty soon after I finished the blue, and I saw a similar thing with the Zaku build on Instagram. I liked the concept, so I just stole it. The upper arms and the chest armor were this cream color, while the main color of the Zaku was this dark red. But I chose to use off-white because it's a little colder, and I think it goes better with the blue. I also didn't want to mix any more colors for the sake of saving as much time as possible. I also decided on gray. I think gray is a really safe bet for secondary colors, especially if you're like me and have a bit of trouble deciding on what paints to use. This gray is nice and cool, so it works well with the blue, and it evens things out because it's darker. But I only use the gray in a few spots because I don't want it to try and compete with the blue for your attention. At first I was thinking of using a darker blue, but thought that would be too basic, and I'm glad I used the gray instead. These shoulders were a point of difficulty for me. The Efreet has these really aggressive shoulders in orange, and at first I didn't want a really bright and dominant color. Although the blue is very light, it has a lot of personality, and choosing a different color to go with it was difficult. I wanted to keep the gray pretty restricted, and I didn't want to use a darker blue, so what I ended up going with is this reddish purple color. It's one of my favorites actually. So painting curved surfaces is kind of my enemy, and I tried really hard to make sure it wouldn't pool in the recessed areas and just dry weird, but the Efreet shoulder design makes this a little hard. Weathering is starting with some physical chipping, and this is really where I start to like how things are turning out. I'm not going to describe the technique because I probably do it in every other painting video I make, but it's a perfect technique for a video like this. It's quicker than painting chips by hand, and it's something you don't need to think about since the size of your chips mainly comes from what you use to chip. Physical chipping is really great stuff. Sometimes you need to be a little cautious, especially if you're using something like sandpaper for chipping, but other than that, I have no complaints. So we're adding a single decal, and I tried something a little different, where I would start to chip it right after giving it a coat of decal softener. I usually wait at least an hour after doing decals to chip them up, but I think this worked because Bandai's water slides are thicker than the third-party ones I usually use. This one decal is of course a Xeon emblem, and for some reason I couldn't get it to sit straight. I would always pick up the model and it would always be at a weird angle. I'm just going ahead with weathering with a pin wash. There's nothing too crazy, there really isn't that much to talk about, it's just a pin wash, but I could start the pin wash on the blue parts at least right after chipping because the blue is slightly glossy, but when I'm finished with those bits I will go and give the model a coat of semi-gloss just so I can actually get the wash to flow on the other colors. I totally could make my own wash, I'm sure it'd be much cheaper, but I just like using this stuff out of the bottle. It's a lot more convenient and it just works better than all of my attempts at making my own wash. It's at the perfect consistency where it'll flow into details, but it won't flow out of the details, creating these gross tide marks. At this point in the build, I realized I had some parts that weren't painted, so I do these leg bits in a dark blue. On its own, I like this shade of blue, but it has a little green in it, so depending on how the light catches, it can sort of look like a dark green. The paint also behaved weird. When I would thin it, it would turn greenish when it would go in the recessed details. It's not the best color to go with a light blue, in my opinion, but I am choosing to stick with it, and now we're just painting the rocket pods that go on the top of these. When I was building this kit, I thought these were the coolest things ever, but now I really don't care for them. They kind of just get in the way and they fall off really easily, not to mention they slow down the painting process a bit. I gave everything a flat coat, and although I liked it, I knew it needed something a little extra before I called it done. I usually go with some gloss speckling, but on this build I wanted some dust effects all over to sort of blend things together and make my paint work a little less harsh. In the past I've used oil paints for dust effects because of their blendability, but those take a lot of time, which I'm trying to cut out. So instead I'm using pigments. I have lots of pigments that are pretty much unused, and I figured they'd be a great simulation for dirt and dust. I simulate chipping by actually chipping my paint, and pigments are the closest thing to dirt without digging a hole in the ground. I'll be sure to cover this in more detail in a future video, but what I do is put a bunch of pigment on the model and get rid of the excess with a moist brush. One thing I want to say is that I'm keeping it a little heavier than I'd like because I'll give the model another flat coat, which makes pigment sort of disappear, so you want it a little heavier just so you can see the final product. The final flat coat is drying. When brainstorming this video, I decided to give myself 48 hours to paint on weather, and I started painting at 9 o'clock PM on Monday. It isn't even 8 o'clock PM yet, and it's the next day, which means that I not only completed this in less than 48 hours, I did it in less than 24. And here it is. As usual, this isn't meant to be a tutorial on what exactly to do with your Gunpla, but a bit of a look into what I've done with the build. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you in the next video, whenever that is.